This is a follow-up to a video I posted recently about Rifa caps and the dangers they pose if they're left across the mains input on vintage equipment. And I had the usual rash of comments contradicting what I was saying or introducing straw man arguments. I thought I'd do this follow-up video because it is quite an interesting topic and there did seem to be quite a lot of interest. But what we're talking about here is the likelihood of a Rifa cap that's across the mains on a piece of vintage equipment failing. And I'm talking here about the experience I've had and witnessed directly, not something I read on Google or a single instance of something. I'm talking here literally about thousands of these capacitors I've seen fail. And over the last sort of 40 years I've been working on vintage equipment. It's got more vintage of course as time's gone on, but even 20 years ago these were a known fail point. In the previous video I said I wasn't sure if it's design or the application. That is, these caps that I've seen fail tend to fail mostly when they've been in a specific application. And I had someone comment saying, yeah, but they've seen them fail somewhere else. They had one fail in a different location. Well, I didn't say they wouldn't fail in other applications, but what I'm talking about here is I've seen 100% failure rate when they were used for a certain application. And that is when they're used across the mains input as a filter cap. And the reason I believe that there's a certain mode of failure is simply because of the number I've seen and also some experimentation I did about 20 years ago now. Now what I've always done when I repair equipment is this. I've always put all the parts I've taken out into bags, and I used to do it just to keep things tidy in the workshop, but also I started doing this so I could return the parts to the owner of the machine. And I started doing that because I was getting some owners, because I don't charge for my time, I only really charge for parts that I fit, and I don't make a profit, I just charge whatever I paid for the parts. But I had the owners of some equipment when I returned it saying I hadn't replaced the parts I'd sent, because there was no evidence the parts had been replaced. Well, if you've watched my videos you'll probably understand why that would be. I'm very careful when I replace parts. I always try to make it look as factory as possible, and I'm assuming they were comparing my work with something they'd done themselves, and they weren't really comparing apples and apples. So what I started doing was returning all the parts I replaced in a bag with the equipment, so there was no argument about what was replaced. But before I did that, what I ended up with was a huge box full of bags of Rifa caps, and I knew where they'd come from because I wrote the machine type on the bag. But I ended up with a box that had nearly 3,000 caps in it, and about a third of them had already failed. The rest I was just swapping out as a matter of course. They were showing signs of imminent failure, so I swapped them. But it got to the point where there were so many I needed to dispose of them, and I was originally going to just throw them away, but then I decided I like experimentation, so I would experiment. And the experiment I decided to do was to try to determine what the failure mode was and what the likely cause could be. It's not 100% accurate, but the first thing is I pointed out that the Rifa caps on the machine I'm currently working on, which is this, were cracking and bulging, and got comments on the video saying, well, cracks don't really mean anything. Well, it's not the real cracking that's the issue, it's the bulging. But even that's not the real issue. The real underlying issue is that they will fail. If they're across the mains, you'll get a 100% failure rate. And the reason I say that is, when I had this big box of Rifa caps, what I decided to do with them was to figure out what the general failure mode was. And another comment in the video was, or in response to the video, was that it could be moisture getting into the capacitors because they were cracked. I think in some cases that might be true, it might be one of the side effects, but I don't believe that's the underlying cause. And the reason I say that is because about a quarter of the caps that I tested had been potted in tar, and about a quarter of the caps I tested had been potted in wax, so they were completely isolated from moisture. And even in this group of capacitors here, get rid of those. If you've watched the previous video in the repair series for this machine, these are all from the same machine, but half of them come from inside a hermetically sealed filter box, so completely cut off from the chance of getting moisture in there, and yet they have aged in exactly the same way, and they failed in exactly the same way as those that were exposed in the main machine. So I don't believe it's just as simple as moisture, because otherwise the ones that were potted or the ones that were in hermetically sealed boxes would fare differently to those that are completely exposed. And as you can see here, it's a very good comparison, because these are all in the same machine, so therefore they're all the same age, and this is something I've seen hundreds and hundreds of times. Now what I did during the testing I carried out was I documented what I was doing. I had about 3,000 caps, and I just selected them randomly as they came out of the box. I didn't test every single one. I had intended to, but to be honest, the house got a little bit unpleasant to live in after the first few days of doing this. If you've ever smelt these caps when they explode, it's a very pungent, unpleasant smell, and if you do that several hundred times, the house becomes almost impossible to live in. And my other half got a bit annoyed and said she got a bit irate and said perhaps I should stop doing it. It's not quite the words she used, but that's what it amounted to. Now what I did when I was carrying out this testing, I put it in a spreadsheet, but this is quite a long time ago, so it's fairly rudimentary. I looked at the application the caps had been put to, and the first column here is where they were used in an AC application. That is, they were generally X caps that were across the mains input. And the second AC is when I was testing it to see if they would fail, I tested them on mains AC voltage. And then I got the failure rates, and this is failure time in minutes. Now where it says 0 is because they'd already failed, so I rounded up. So the minimum I could get in a failure in this test was 1. The zeros are for ones I got out of the box that had already failed in this application, and the other numbers are the time in minutes before they did fail. And it was a 1 hour test, so if we get a 60 it means it didn't fail. I only got one that didn't fail. The second column, AC application, so it was used in an AC filtering cap, exactly the same as the first column. The only difference is I tested it using a DC voltage, and the DC voltage I used was the rectified and smooth mains voltage. So in other words, it's about 340 volts DC, and that was to see if the failure mode was provoked by having AC or DC across it, and it made pretty much no difference. It seemed to be a slightly lower, but the difference was too small to really call. But the point here is that the application of it being in an AC filter is what seemed to provoke the real issue. The third column is where it was in a DC application, so it was used in, for example, like the big cap we had in this machine, the HP 9845, where it was across the 330 volt DC rail. So it's DC application but high voltage, normally the same sort of thing, and again I did both AC and DC testing. So the first thing you can notice, where there's a gap, it means it didn't fail at all. So the first thing to notice here is that the vast majority of those that were in a DC application didn't fail even after I carried out this test. And this was again a 1 hour test, so they're all given an hour, and it might be if I'd given them a day or 2 days they would have failed, but what I'm trying to do here is a direct comparison. So the reason I say that I believe the application of them being put across the AC mains is indicative or part of the failure mode is due to this data. Now if we turn this into some statistics, we end up with this, and the mean time for failure for the AC application AC test was 2.9 minutes. AC application DC test 2.5 minutes, slightly shorter but so close as to pretty much be the same. But the failure count was the same in both. So the DC application AC test, the mean failure time for those that did fail was 13 minutes, but only 21 out of 119 actually failed. And DC application DC test, only 16 out of the same number, again 119, only 16 of them failed. So there's a direct correlation here, and I think the numbers were high enough. A sample of 119 I believe was high enough to give me some confidence that what we're looking at here is real. That's not to say they won't fail in other applications, but certainly if they've been across the AC mains for any length of time and then left, there seems to be a very high probability of failure. The reason I say I don't believe that it's just as simple as moisture getting into them that causes a failure is because of the ones I tested. If we assume that up into the atmosphere is our control group, then the difference percentage wise between the control group, the ones in the open atmosphere, and ones that were tar potted, the tar potted ones seem to fail at a rate of about -2% compared to the control group. Those that were wax potted, 4% higher, and those that were in sealed boxes, such as the ones we're looking at here, +6%. And there was 84 of those, 57 of the wax potted ones and 39 of the tar potted ones. So it's quite a decent sized group, but the percentage difference is so small. There is a difference, but it's so small as to really indicate that there's not anything there. It's not just a case of being exposed to moisture that causes this. My personal opinion is that it's breakdown of the plasticizers in the dielectric separator that causes it, but it doesn't really matter. The point was, change them, they will fail, and the fact that they fail in other applications is irrelevant. They will fail if they're across the mains, so my recommendation is to change them. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I can pretty much guarantee if you don't do that, they will fail. Now, one other thing that I would point out here is this capacitor is the one that was across the 330 volts DC rail in our HP machine, the one I'm currently working on. And all the time I've been talking, I'm going to move the camera for the Doubting Thomases, all the time I've been talking, this has been connected to the bench supply, and it's set to 240 volts. And it's been like that now for about 5 hours. It was on well before I started this video. It's been on all the time I've been talking, and I've got quite a high degree of confidence that even though this is the same age, it is cracked, it's not going to fail. It's not in imminent danger of failing. Now, having said that, I still think it will fail fairly quickly, and I would change it, but it's very different to the ones that are sourced from being across the AC mains. I've got a fairly high degree of confidence based on what I've seen, the testing I've done, that firstly they'll fail if you leave them, but also that if they're across the AC mains they're more likely to fail. And of course if they're across the AC mains and they fail, it's a much bigger event than if they're in an amplifier or something. So just be aware of that. It's entirely your choice, but my recommendation is if you find these and they're showing any signs of distress at all, change them. If you find them and they're not showing any signs of distress, I would still change them, even if they don't look cracked or anything like that. I would still change them. The fact they're cracking is in some ways irrelevant. It's really when they start bulging that you have to start getting worried. So this one's bulging, I can feel it, and it does have some cracks in it, but it's really the bulging that is giving me cause for concern, and also the discoloration. If you look at the base of this, you can see it's starting to go brown, and that's normally a sign that it's about to start going into failure mode. The ones that are silver throughout, I won't pick this up because it's got mains on it, but if we looked at the bottom of this, it would still be silver and it will be clean all the way through. Just try and spin it round. There's no sign of brown on the bottom of this, but as I said, I would still change this simply because of the number of failures of these devices I've had. But I'm still convinced that putting these across the AC mains provokes or accelerates their failure mode.